Hello and welcome to the next webinar in TFP's webinar series, talking everything retirement. So today's webinar is really crucial as we're going to start talking and drilling down into some of the things around how you spend your time and how that impacts your thoughts around retirement. So the title of this webinar is the 3 phases of retirement and how it should impact how you spend your money and your time. The bottom line is, when it comes to retirement, time is more important than money. Now, we can argue all we like around how much you need and how much is enough, but we've got to a point in our life that we're stepping away from full-time employed work, potentially, and we're thinking about how we spend our time. Now, this is really important when we set up the foundation of how we think about the 3 phases of retirement, because those 3 phases that we're going to talk about is really fundamentally different when it comes to how you spend your time and your money. And it's about understanding those 3 phases and ultimately taking advantage of them when you can. So what are those 3 phases? Well, there's been some great books written on this, and my framework for these 3 phases, and it's not my own, it's stuff that I've read and learned about. But the framework that I love and that I use with everybody is the framework of your go-go, go slow, and no-go years. So we need to understand that these 3 phases of retirement have very different requirements. We are different in ourselves, both mentally and physically. We are different in the way that we can take advantage of our time, and we're different in the way that we spend our money. Now, the go-go years are typically any time between when you feel like you are financially independent, you stop work, or you're working because you want to, and you're now thinking about how to spend your time. So let's say it's typically any time between the ages of 55 and 65. Ultimately, that's when we start to think about it and start to execute on that. Now, these numbers aren't made up. These numbers are baked in years of working with retirees and understanding all of the research that's out there across the globe around when these phases start to come in. And typically, and it's pretty near damn it most of the time, we hit our early 70s, typically around 72, 73, and then we enter what we call our go slow years. When we get into around 82 plus, from an age perspective, then we go into our no-go years. That is our later life. So look, as it sounds, go-go is when you're aspirational. Go slow is when we start to slow down and start thinking really truly about our time. And then no-go is when, you know, we're in later life. Things are very different, and you know, all those things that we wanted to do mentally and physically, we are now are unable. So I'm going to touch on each one of these in a bit more detail and go through some of my thoughts around each one of these stages. But I think it's really, firstly, it's really crucial, and you would have seen this drawing before, and it's on the wall behind me. If you've listened to other webinars, it is so crucial to understand that health span is different to lifespan. So when we start to plan our retirement and we start to plan those 3 phases, the go-go years going into the slow-go years is all about taking advantage of our health. Our health span is lower and less than our lifespan. Yes, we are alive longer, but we're not necessarily, you know, we're not living longer. So lifespan and our kind of life expectancy has increased, but actually our health span hasn't increased that dramatically with it. So, you know, we've got very good at keeping people alive during their later life, but actually people are still dropping off from a health perspective. And so what does that mean, really? There's some wonderful stats in the States, and it does apply to over here, and research has been done that says typically when we're at the end of our health span, there's on average about another 12 years of lifespan left. So there's 12 years where we're not doing it. We can't take advantage of anything because, physically, mentally, we're nowhere in a position to do so. So it's really crucial to understand our health deteriorates through time, but our life may be longer. And that's where we want to make sure that we take advantage of those, particularly that first phase and into that second phase, because we get into the no-go years and there simply isn't going to be any way that we can do that. So let's talk about this, but I'm going to talk about it in reverse. So the no-go years, when the block of time that we've got here is limited, when the ability to do anything is limited. These years are typically later life. We are more concerned about heating and eating. That's kind of where we're at. Very little, if any, discretionary spending goes on at this point. There might be thoughts around care costs, which I'll get onto in a second. But ultimately, this is a period of time in our lives where we're not spending any significant amounts of money. When it comes to thinking about this, I think a lot of people have, and because they listen to a lot of this financial industry rubbish that's out there around, people are living longer. I get it. But I want you to observe people, observe your family, your parents or your grandparents, and think about what they were like in their mid-80s. Typically, and there are exceptions to this rule, and I know there are 80, 90-year-olds doing skydiving and all of that stuff. But typically, when we get to that point, we're at a point in our lives where, simply discretionary spending doesn't happen. So we need to make sure that we understand this. Our money should not be saved up for a period in our life when we are absolutely not going to need it. It should not be saved up for a period in life when we are going to struggle to spend it. It should not be saved up for a period of life where we just, we have no ability to take advantage of the hard work that we put in pre-retiring to accumulate money. We should really start to think about taking advantage of the green and the amber. So I think it's really crucial to understand this. One of the things I will say is, and I'll come on to this point in a second, but real-time spending falls by about 1% a year in retirement. So we look, really what we tend to do, we look at today's expenditure and we go, well, I've got to spend this plus inflation for the next 20, 30 years. And that simply is not true. Real-time expenditure falls by about 1% a year. So if you're 62 and you retire, what you spend now will typically be 20% less of what you spend now when you're 82. So we have to take into consideration that our spending actually falls. And that's the kind of numbers we need to think about when we get into our 80s. I also want to touch on care costs. Now, in earlier webinars, we touched on care costs and how they're perceived. I think it is very much overblown. I think a lot of the care cost rhetoric that we get in this country comes from the likes of the United States, when they are so much less fortunate than us when it comes to care costs. They have vehicles to provide long-term care because they have no NHS. They have no National Health Service. Say what you want about it. Everyone has an opinion. But there is an ability to provide some provision of care. Ultimately, people think that they need to save this massive number to provide care in later life. But even if you go top end and spend 80 or 90,000 pounds on a care home in a year, typically when we get into, again, baked in research, this is not my guesswork, when we get into our 80s and 90s and we need care, full-time care, so you're in a position mentally and physically that you need full-time care, will last about 6 to 9 months on average. In this country, we tend to step that in. So we have people come into our homes. we phase in the level of care that we need. So, you know, budgeting £100,000 for 3 years of care fees is prudent, but it's beyond prudent. It could actually take away your ability to feel like you can free the shackles and live your life in the time when you can live it. So get the truth about it. It's important to make sure that you are not dependent on the state and dependent on your family when you get into later life. But saving for care fees is massively overblown and prevents people from actually enjoying their money and their time. When we get into our go slow years, so we're going backwards here because I want to finish on the most positive. You know, this is actually a really interesting period for people. This is a period of reflection. They're still active. They're still doing things. Discretionary spending falls. Again, think about friends and family that you've observed in this stage of life. Discretionary spending falls. And we start to really, I think time becomes ever more present. It becomes ever more thoughtful. We really do now have an appreciation of time and how we're spending it. Many of our friends may have passed away. You know, there's huge periods of grief during these go slow years because friendships and family, etc., ends up, you know, deserting us. But we are still active. Typically, what I see in this period, this is the period where people start to think about, actually, you know, I've hopefully enjoyed my time, and we get onto the go-go years in a second. I've kind of budgeted for what I think is prudent from a care cost, and there's all this extra money I'm not going to spend. Typically, this is when we see, you know, giving start to happen. We start to make sure that our time is spent wisely. Simpler things start to matter. Time with friends and family and grandchildren, time outside, health. You know, these simple things start to matter. And quite simply, again, we're not in a position mentally and physically, again, there are exceptions to the rule, mentally and physically to actually take full advantage of this money. We're not really, again, exceptions. We're not really going to think about the 6-month cruise or the or the trip to Australia. You know, the big bucket list items, the big ticket items, the traveling, the constant the constant travel, etc., is something that we simply do not want to do. We do mentally and physically decline, and actually, this is a period where that decline can happen really, really rapidly. So this is a really crucial time. It's the transition. It's the transition that you go through from aspirational go-go years to true later life. And that transition can be humbling, but it also can be really rewarding. You can actually now figure out the real simple things that give you pleasure and joy, spend your money on that, whilst knowing that you have done the things previously that you wanted to do. So going into the go-go years, this is the biggest block of kind of opportunity that exists in the 3 phases of retirement. This is when you're at your healthiest, your fittest, your most aspirational. You've got as much money as you'll hopefully ever have at that point, because we want to spend it. This is when you can take full advantage of your time. This is where retirement rebels thrive. This is where those people that want to stop work to go and create memories and experiences before it's too late, before they can't, either, this is not talking necessarily about death, but this is as you go through the transitions and the 3 phases. This is where everything happens. This is where the focus needs to be for retirement rebels, for people that want to step back from a big corporate career and understand that there is a window of opportunity that exists. That window typically, as I said, slams shut or is slightly left ajar in your early 70s. So the longer you leave it, the longer that you're fearful, the longer that you don't know how to spend, the longer that you don't have a really proper life-orientated, centered retirement plan, The longer that you don't understand how you can spend your money, the more you're going to eat into this window of opportunity, the more that you're getting to the amber years, the go slow years, and you won't be able to do it. This is where aspiration lies. And it's so important that you understand that this is health span at its best. This is where you need to take advantage. This is where you would travel. You'd spend time. You'd maybe give some money away. You would volunteer. You would do the things that you've always wanted to do. You'd do the skydive. You'd do the abseil. You would, all these things, health and time is on your side. You know, I think the days of being 60 and old are gone. I think, you know, 60-year-olds now look nothing like 60-year-olds a generation ago even. We need to make sure that we are absolutely crystal clear in taking advantage of this, because it's so, so important. Framing these 3 phases really helps people to understand the ideal spending pattern. It really helps people to understand that, you know, I don't need to leave my money on the table. Proper retirement planning will allow you to understand these 3 phases properly and bring forward or front load the fun. Not wait for this thing that won't ever happen, or squirrel away your money to make sure that you've got enough for a rainy day, because that rainy day will never happen and you won't be here to spend it, and someone else will spend it for you. And that ideal spending pattern is really important, so important. So if you think about those go years, go slow years, and no-go years in the time frame, and actually you think about what most retirees do without any planning or guidance, they don't spend enough. They decline their spending over the go years and go slow years. They then get into a period in later life when actually they end up spending a lot more money than they should. Basically, it's, you know, whether it's care homes, it's taxes are rife in later life, because if you haven't spent the money's there to be taxed. And when you do need to spend it, it's taxed. So most retirees without a plan will forego their happiness. They will do things that directly impact their happiness and their purpose negatively. They will wait, they will hold on, and they won't spend the money, and they will have accumulated so much money towards the end of life. I mentioned it in a webinar previously, but all of the research that's now been conducted over the last 40, 50 years of this kind of modern day way of thinking about retiring suggests that on average, retirees leave about 70% of their starting net worth on the table at the end of retirement. Just think about that. You start with £1 million. On average, you'll leave £700,000 on the table. You'll only ever go through £300,000. Because if you start at 60, you've got a long-term investment time horizon. And we know that given time, investments, equity markets do well. Over every 20-year time horizon, they've done very, very well. So the growth of your investments, coupled with the decline of real-time spending by about 1% a year, coupled with the fact that people don't feel free enough to spend their money whilst time and health on the side, so they underspend anyway, means that you get to a period of your time, no-go years, and you've got 50, 60, 70% of your starting pot still left. That's nuts. So the ideal spending pattern to really think about is one of the blue line, one that creates joy, happiness, freedom, memories and experiences, ones where you think about, I need to spend my money on what's most important to me whilst I can, recognizing that this is a big upward tick and will continue to go upward. You might spend more money year in, year out for the first 5 or 10 years, but knowing that things slow down, your expenditure drops over time to a point where you just don't need to spend much anymore. And that's so, so important to understand. That ideal spending pattern is achieved with guidance, advice, accountability, and understanding, pre-work about your identity, everything we talked about before, your purpose, your identity, what you want to do, what you're retiring to, all of that stuff will make sure that you spend your money on what's most important to you whilst time and health is on your side. Because ultimately, what we don't want to do is this. Don't leave it too late to spend your money, because I don't really care about tax. The most important thing to understand, and what is an absolute travesty, is that you lose all those potential experiences and memories that you could have created in earlier life. As your net worth grows, and as you get it into later life, you haven't left money on the table. You've left memories and experiences with loved ones on the table. There's a wonderful book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, which is a palliative nurse who interviewed people right at the end of their life. And this is what they said, right? I wish I'd have taken more risks. I wish I'd have spent more money on the people, with the people, and created memories and experiences. What am I doing here? I've got money and I can't do it. This is achievable. People need to look inside themselves and work with expert people to ensure that they can absolutely not end up in this position. We have some wonderful free resources. The QR codes on here will take you through to my 7-step retirement toolkit, which takes you through the 7 steps of understanding and identity and passion and purpose and income and longevity and everything. So it's a really good free toolkit, one of the best out there for you to kind of work through. My podcast, Humans versus Retirement, tackles these issues all of the time with expert guests. Have a listen. And the Humans versus Retirement website contains blogs and my sketches for you to understand. If you did want to ever chat about anything to do with your retirement planning, then please do not hesitate to get in touch and book a call. We can talk about anything you want. There's so much to do with planning a modern day retirement, because as humans, we're simply not wired for that. So please get in touch. Please let me understand some of your challenges and issues and opportunities and what you want to do, and then we can have a conversation around that. So it's been a pleasure to have you with us on the webinar. I hope that really resonates with you, and I look forward to sharing with you more thoughts about retirement planning next month. Take care.